Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Your Excellency, President of Al-Faisal, King Faisal Laureates, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Al-Faisal University's Pioneers in Science Day. Launched by the King Faisal Foundation, the King Faisal Prize recognizes the outstanding works of individuals and institutions in 5 major categories: service to Islam, Islamic studies, Arabic language and literature, medicine, and science. It is the most prestigious award of the Muslim world. We are incredibly honored to officially host the King Faisal Laureates in Medicine and Science 2023 for their lectures today, presenting you a unique opportunity to learn about the groundbreaking research and the outstanding works of the laureates for which they have been awarded. This morning we will start with the science lectures, after which we will have a short break and move on to the medicine lectures. Our first lecture today is by Professor Chad Mirkin, titled Exploring and Expanding the Matterverse with Nanomaterial Mega Libraries and AI. Professor Chad Mirkin, the co-laureate of the 2023 King Faisal Prize in Science, is a director of the International Institute for Nanotechnology and the George B. Rathman Professor of Chemistry, Professor of Chemical and Biological Engineering, Professor of Biomedical Engineering, Professor of Material Science and Engineering, and the Professor of Medicine at Northwestern University. He is a world-renowned nanoscience expert who is known for his discovery and development of spherical nucleic acids, SNAs, and SNA-based biodetection and therapeutic schemes, the invention of dip pen nanolithography and related cantilever-free nanopatterning methodologies, on-wire lithography, coaxial lithography, and contributions to supramolecular chemistry and nanoparticle synthesis. He is the author of over 850 manuscripts and over 1,200 patent applications worldwide, over 400 of which have been issued, and the founder of multiple companies including Nanosphere, AuraSense, TerraPrint, Azul 3D, MatIQ, and Flashpoint Therapeutics. Now, before I welcome Professor Chad Mirkin, I'd like to play a short video for you.
For this goal and for this challenge, discovering, designing, developing new materials is really critical. But it depends on new materials for all sorts of different purposes. Like chemical converters, fuel cells, new materials within those make them either efficient or useful or not. Being able to find the best materials is absolutely essential. I would argue that the world right now is focusing on the best thing discovered today, not necessarily the best for doing application. So what we're going to do through the collaboration with Toyota begin to look at the vast parameters that are possible in these materials, collect data from that, and then empower machine learning and AI algorithms to allow us to objectively search the materials we need and find the best materials for a given need.
Before we were using machine learning, all of our materials design was trial and error. So we had to synthesize one material and then characterize it, and then synthesize the next one and characterize that, and hope that any one of those would give us properties of interest that we couldn't tell.
Traditionally, we pursue new ideas by human intuition, the things that scientists think might be interesting. They have some idea that they want to try out. The kind of technologies that we're leveraging here at Northwestern University, it allows us to go beyond that, because not only can we use our intuition, but now we have the possibility of looking at a vast number of things that would not be possible otherwise. And that helps us look for things that we might not have thought of.
Every element has its unique properties and is different from every other element. And combinations of elements will interact with each other. Their electronic structure is influenced by the atoms around it. So depending on what they are, you can end up with a material that has vastly different properties. It can form different crystal structures that will have different surfaces, different electronic structures.
Product of the modern age of nanotechnology. We invented a whole series of what we call nano printers here. Think of a printer that's got a print head that has 100,000 or more pyramidal tips. Those can be coated with chemicals, gradients of chemicals, and then brought down, and those materials can be deposited onto a chip of interest. Being able to control particle size and shape on the nanoscale in the context of a mega library is very important, because many of the active catalysts that go into fuel cells, that go into catalytic converters, that are used for catalyzing all of the important processes out there are nanomaterials. 1 nanometer would be, take a dime, slice it on edge 1,000 times, take one of those pieces, slice it another 1,000 times on edge. That's 1 nanometer thick.
Nanoparticles have very unique properties in terms of their catalytic activity. They make for good catalysts because they have a high surface area to volume ratio because they're so small. So ideally, when we make nanoparticles, we're able to make particles that have a lot of available surface for catalyzing reactions and use less of a valuable material like platinum, for example, that goes into a fuel cell. So the more active the catalyst is, the more power it will produce for less fuel. So it basically means the fuel cell will be more efficient.
We're in a really unique position to take this all the way, to think about how we not only discover materials in a new way, how we create this platform, but ultimately how we deploy this platform in a company like Toyota to really make a difference in their business, and figuring out how we can strengthen the relationships between the company researchers, the company business folks, and the people on the ground at the university doing the discovery work would be really quite powerful, because it would allow us to streamline how we go from this called fundamental discovery process to real applications that can make a difference in Toyota and around the world.
So research partnerships between universities and organizations like Toyota are critical, because universities have the freedom to explore and have the scientific curiosity to really drive forward the frontier of human knowledge. And what we can bring to the university partnership is a concern about making the best technology we like. So where those two things intersect, where the interest in providing technology for society and where the frontiers of human knowledge are, that's really where we can come together and do something really valuable.
What's exciting is we don't know what the limits are. We don't know what the best performing devices and technologies that we can make can be. And so there's always this idea that there's something better out there if we just look in the right place. And so it might be that we look for a long time and never find it, but the possibility that we might is what's exciting.
So please join me in welcoming Professor Chad Mirkin.
Really? They can't hear me. That'll be better. Should take this one off. No. Okay, great. First of all, that video sets the stage really for what I want to talk about today. And it's a journey and a technology and an approach that I think is going to dramatically change many aspects of the world, and certainly several aspects here in Saudi Arabia. In fact, we're in the midst of talking to folks like Saudi Aramco to see how we can really exploit many of the capabilities you're going to hear about to find materials that matter there, materials that matter especially in the clean energy space. Before I get into that, though, I'm going to kind of step back and set the stage of how we got there, how we got to this particular capability that I think is so transformational. But I do want to thank really a lot of people before I get started. First, the KFP Foundation for this incredible honor. Solomon, who's just done an amazing job in terms of making this all possible and orchestrating this around the world in so many different sectors, and being just a spectacular host while we've been here. I've been here now for several days, over jet lag, which is good. The students and faculty have been just sensational, really represent Saudi Arabia and their organizations extremely well, really impressive. And then I've had my own students here, Ali Al-Hassan, a star student who's really built an incredible reputation here and capability. It's really impressive to see all the fantastic things that are going on here. Then finally, I want to thank my secretary for sending in a 20-year-old picture to put on the front cover. That's very, very important. I have a mental note to give her a raise. Ali noted, he goes, "How old is that picture?" That's probably old. In any event, I thought I'd spend the next 35 minutes kind of telling you about this journey that I think is really quite exciting and has an interesting start. I think some of you have followed some of the work that we've done at Northwestern. I was really at the right place at the right time when I started my career. We built one of the largest nanotech operations in the world. It, to this day, is probably the largest pure nanotech operation in the world, focusing really on understanding the consequences of miniaturization and developing tools in the early days that allowed us to, first of all, make and manipulate nanostructures in unique ways so that we could study them and look at those consequences and make structure-function relationships and then ultimately utilize some of those capabilities to create technologies that would make a difference in many different sectors. And you heard about some of them, spanning heavily medicine, how we track and treat disease, but also in additive manufacturing, and as today you're going to see in clean energy, among other areas. Now, one of the tools that we invented back in 1999 was often referred to as the world's smallest pen. It was called dip pen nanolithography. And I had never used an AFM before in my life. Again, right place, right time. They were just becoming commercial, and I thought this is a tool that we need to learn how to use to study surfaces. And we had one in a facility, and we began to study surfaces in a variety of different ways, and we discovered something very interesting, and that was that when you run an AFM in air, water will naturally collect at the point of contact and form a meniscus. That's called the capillary effect. That's the thermodynamic sink for water in the environment to move to. And that's usually viewed as a problem in scanning probe microscopy. Well, I was trained as a chemist, and I looked at that and I said, wait, we could use that as a solvent and kind of as a local reactor to locally control chemistry on a surface. So instead of using an AFM, which was what it was invented for as a reader, we could think about using it as a writer or to locally control chemistry on a surface. And that was the birth of dip pen nanolithography. So now with dip pen, what you would do is you would take molecules, coat them on AFM tips, run an AFM experiment, establish a point of contact, let water collect, and then use the chemical driving force of molecules reacting with an underlying substrate to drive the movement of those molecules to the surface, and you could create add layers that were one molecule high. Pretty interesting concept. Published it in Science magazine. People began to run with it and ask, hey, how can we begin to study systems and look at reduced dimensionality to understand some of these structure-function relationships? And to this day, it's used heavily for that purpose. There are commercial instruments that we established that ultimately populated many of the labs around the world, and it's used as a workhorse tool. You can see in the lower right-hand corner, it's a diffusion limited process. Those are alkane thiol features made on gold substrates. So alkane thiols are the inks, the substrate or the paper in this case is gold. Thiol reacting with the gold is the driving force. The longer you hold the tip in contact, the bigger the feature you get. So you could control on the nanoscale both composition and also feature size. Now let's fast forward. So a lot happened over the next couple of decades. We began to look at this and say, hey, let's turn this into a tool that lots of people can use. And hence we thought about commercialization. And we created some of the first commercial dip pen tools. Pretty soon though, scientists are not softies when it comes to criticism. They look at this and say, well, this is nice, but this is a really slow process. And it's an academic type of tool. It's never going to be used for anything of utility because you're patterning a 100 by 100 micron field of view. At the same time, there was a pretty famous lab, George Whiteside's, I think was also a King Faisal Prize winner in earlier days, was developing something called micro-contact printing. And a lot of people thought these were competitive tools at the time. They're not, actually. They're highly complementary. Contact printing is a great way of printing in parallel over large areas. You can't go very small. You can go down to about 200 nanometers. We can go down to 10 nanometers. Very custom. Theirs is transfer one pattern, and that's what you get. And it's used for all sorts of different purposes as well. Well, we looked at this and said, hey, we could take these two techniques and merge them, get almost all the strengths, and eliminate most of the weaknesses. And that was the birth of a technique called polymer pen lithography. So in polymer pen lithography, we would create a stamp of pyramids, elastomeric pyramids, and we'd mount them on a glass substrate, no longer having an AFM cantilever, And we would insert that into a piezo-driven device that would allow us to translationally move back and forth with nanometer precision and up and down with nanometer precision. And now we could have many point sources, locally controlling chemistry over large areas. And by many, I mean extraordinarily large numbers. We've made arrays, working arrays with as many as 11 million of these tips, all tips working over many square centimeter surfaces. So now you had something that was incredibly scalable. And we began to look at how we could use this, at least as we initially envisioned it, as a tool to prototype devices. We thought of them as desktop fabs. We could make microelectronic devices, we could make microfluidics, and they're used for that purpose. But over time, we began to think of this in a different way, going back to my chemistry roots. We could think of these as the world's most powerful synthesis tools. Because you not only could control chemistry from the tips, you could actually control photochemistry with the tips. You could take light and drive it down the back of the pyramid, squeeze it out, and effectively control photochemistry on the other side with sub 200 nanometer resolution, both in the near and the far field. That was pretty powerful. And so pretty soon you could think about all these tips as tiny little fingers locally controlling chemistry over the large areas of the surface, and that allows you to begin to build massive libraries of materials. And so I want to talk about those in the context of what we call mega libraries. A mega library in the low end has 1 million different compositions, all positionally encoded on the surface. On the high end, it can have billions. So these are incredibly information-rich chips, if you will, where we can synthesize more materials in a single experiment than scientists have cumulatively made to date. It's really a profound observation. And so that made us begin to think, hey, this is a powerful tool that we can use for materials discovery. And then when you think of these all within the context of one chip, it's also a source of big data, big first-party data that you control for the materials discovery space. And that gives you the ability to think about uniquely training machine learning and AI algorithms in a way that they've never been trained before, so that we then can begin to make predictions about where the next materials are that will make a big difference given a particular area of interest. And so that became kind of our strategy. Could we develop a new approach to rapid materials discovery using these concepts? Well, you guys know this is a challenge, right? Because the complexity is enormous. Our palette is not just the combinations of elements in the periodic table, the number, stoichiometry, type, but also when we talk about nanomaterials and when we're talking about developing catalysts, for example, for clean energy, which is, I am going to talk a lot about that, it's not just the composition, it's the size, the shape, the phase structure of the material that ultimately dictates its properties. So the number of possibilities is extraordinary. And so when you think about our current paradigm as chemists of going and looking at these one at a time, learning, using intuition to make and explore and study, that's a really slow process. It's no big surprise that we really find materials that make a difference at a relatively slow rate as a civilization. And again, if you think about how I move AI into this particular space, I also have a limitation in terms of the data sets that are available. It's very disparate, and I don't have enough big data to really make a difference in terms of training. And so to give people a feel for how difficult and how challenging this is, here are just a set of parameters that might matter: composition, size, shape, phase structure, the structuring within the particle. If I say, okay, not all elements in the periodic table are relevant, some of them are not going to be parts of catalysts that we're going to make, reduce it to 61, restrict size ranges to a reasonable number, compositional changes in terms of increments. You look at the numbers, they get up to very, very large numbers very, very quickly. And this is a limited set of parameters. So you are not going to solve this problem of finding the best materials for a given need if you are going to do this in a serial way. That's at least our general hypothesis. So that's where mega libraries come in. We're still going to use intuition and say, hey, we think these elements, these combinations might be important, but we're going to collect massive data sets with mega libraries synthesized with these types of tools. And then we're going to use that data and ultimately train AI and build in the process what we think is going to be the world's most powerful materials AI. And the premise or the proposition is quite simple. That's going to dramatically accelerate the pace at which we discover and hopefully decrease the cost associated with discovery. So how do you do it? You need 3 silos. Okay, this isn't just about synthesis. So I've talked a little bit about the synthesis tools, and I'm going to show you how those work. In building a mega library, every feature is a discrete material. That's what's important. It's not a slurry of materials, it's a discrete material with a well-defined structure. Not just enough to synthesize quickly. We also have to have the ability to get the data out. How do we correlate structure, function, properties that are relevant and important? And then we have to take that data and ultimately collate it and use it to train algorithms so that we actually get meaningful predictions from the machine learning types of protocols. That requires many different teams of people working in concert with one another, working towards a common goal, and keeping these moving at comparable rates. Because if you become the world's best synthesis capability, but you're really lousy at screening, the bottleneck is screening. So let me share you some of the ways that we've gone about doing this in this short presentation. So one of the things that we've been pushing now for about a decade is this concept of nanoreactors. As chemists, we typically synthesize things in a massively parallel fashion in a beaker, right? You make moles of materials. You make a lot of particles at once when you do a colloidal synthesis. But they're not positionally encoded, and they all can be subtly different, and so I'm kind of looking at an ensemble average in terms of properties. Another way to think about doing this is to put it on substrates and locally control a reaction where all reactants effectively convert into one product. Some people in the past have thought about this. Dick Crooks, a really good friend of mine from Texas, came up with a really interesting idea, which was to use dendrimers. I think Forshey was a KFP winner as well for dendrimers. Dendrimers is important materials that can be modified with a discrete number of metal atoms, and within those dendrimers you could locally reduce and convert all of those atoms into a single particle. And he did some pretty interesting things, but of course that's a pretty slow process, and that's done in solution and nothing's positionally encoded. And you can't make lots of different types of compositions very rapidly. So we came along and we said we could use these tools, these scanning probe tools, and block copolymers, in this case polyethylene oxide poly-2-vinyl pyridine, loaded up with metal salts ahead of time, and we could use the tips to locally deposit blobs of material, polymeric blobs of material onto a hydrophobic substrate. We call those nanoreactors. Those reactors are incredibly reproducible in terms of volume, size, dimensions. What that means is we can create a reactor that has almost a countable number of metal atoms within it. And then we can post-treat, thermally for example, under a reducing environment, blow away the polymer, reduce the metal atoms, and if all things work properly, all the atoms in that reactor will coalesce to form a single particle. To give you a feel for how small these are, they are attoliters to yoctoliters. You can look up those prefixes in terms of volume. These are tiny, tiny reactors. Does it work? Well, we start with tetrachloroauric acid, a gold salt, and you can see in the lower left here, it works remarkably well. If I put down a tip and touch it lightly, I can make a tiny reactor, maybe call it 170 nanometers in diameter. If I hold it for a longer period of time, it grows in size up to about 220 nanometers in diameter. That's the reactor size. When I post-thermally treat, I end up getting gold particles, a single particle in every feature, and it correlates with the size of the reactor. What you put in the reactor ends up in the particle. I'll prove that to you over and over and over again in many of the experiments I share with you today. That's not particularly small. So we say, let's get smaller by making smaller reactors. Let's make a lot of them. So we use the polymer pen lithography tool where we make millions and millions of particles, in this case all designed to be the same size, 4.8 plus or minus a tenth of a nanometer. And if you look in the middle here, that's exactly what you get. These are all a single gold particle where every reactor was. We can get massive statistics from this. We know that these types of syntheses are better than the best solution phase syntheses out there. That's because we can control the size and volume of the reactor with the lithographic techniques that I've shared with you. How do we know everything goes into one particle product? Well, this is a great surface science tool too. I can take it and put it under an electron microscope, cool it down, and I can watch the birth, growth, and maturation of a particle. And here you can watch that yourself. And I always like to say I feel like a fraud. I taught general chemistry for 30 years, and I tell the students about Oswald ripening. I'd never seen Oswald ripening until I saw this. So Oswald ripening, remember, is where big particles grow at the expense of other particles. These particles dissolve and their atoms go in to form the larger particles. You're going to watch that occur. It's actually different from a process called coalescence, where two particles come together and merge. Both are occurring here, and that's one of the interesting fundamental things you get out of this. You can actually track trajectories, and you'll see this as I play the movie, which are just mini frames put together watching the growth of a gold particle. So those are all the little nuclei. You can see them coming together, and eventually you'll end up with one single particle at the end of the reaction. Pretty neat. So this gives us an incredible tool now to study where we can set up a reaction where all the reactants are in one reactor, and we know they're going to go to one particular product. Kind of an unusual situation, and we know exactly where it is. What I said is what you put in the particle, or what you put in the reactor ends in the particle. You can kind of see that here. These now are 3-component particles where I have gold and silver. The EDAX is giving us the color coding. That kind of orange color is the gold and silver. That's kept at a 1-to-1 ratio. The green is nickel content. And we've intentionally gone from 20% to 80% nickel content, kept the gold and silver ratio at 1-to-1. And you can see there's almost a perfect linear relationship. Okay, so that's powerful. If we're going to think about synthesizing deliberately megalibraries where we can control at least composition and size, we need to have that type of understanding. Now you push this. So I started telling the students, that's great, three-component particles, nice. Let's start making particles that people have never made before. So let's make a library of 7 element particles. Make every combination you can think of. All a single component, 2-component, 3-component, 4-component, 5-component, 6-component, 7-component. The vast majority of these had never been on the planet before. Okay, so the first thing you see is you can make them. The second is single particle per feature, and they have tortured structures, right? They consist of alloy domains, heterostructures. Interestingly, they don't form different broken particles. They form one particle. The process actually coalesces and brings them all together. And that alone creates an interesting question about engineering. How do you actually engineer architectures? I'll come back to that in a second, ahead of time, as opposed to just make and discover without knowing much ahead of time. What about going small? I used to tell the students, look, we should be able to go down to a single atom. Just keep diluting. Make these reactors smaller and smaller, and eventually you should be able to place a single atom here and a single atom here. That's conceptually possible. It's practically really difficult. And the reason is not because you can't find it, because we know where it has to be, but when you keep diluting the loading of the metal salt within the polymer, you run into a sampling problem. So if you have enough of the atoms present, you always grab a sample that basically has the same number of atoms that I have over here. When I go to smaller and smaller particles, I run into a problem where I get a really broad deviation in terms of particle sizes and compositions. So this student, Peng Chen, was very clever. He said, here's the problem. We have this backbone, this block copolymer, and you've got a lot of sites that can hold metal ions. Let's go to a situation where we have polymers that have a single end cap, that have a porphyrin, that we can put whatever metal we'd like. So one polymer strand, one atom. And then we can pick the number of polymer strands and mix them, and then we know for every polymer strand we have one atom. And that should allow us to make tinier particles with higher degrees of confidence. So now you can see in the far right here, the reactor size on the left, getting down to 60 nanometer reactor. We have to use dip pen to go to the really tiny features here, just to really push the capabilities. 60 nanometers in terms of reactor size. Down to less than 20 nanometers. The particles go from about, call it 6 nanometers in size, down to the bottom one that has roughly 22 atoms. It's less than a nanometer in size. We're pushing the limits of the electron microscope in terms of characterizing. These are aberration-corrected microscopes that are used to characterize these types of materials. So I think that's exciting as well, because it says that we can now begin to control size the way we'd like to get into a regime where we're going to see a lot of action in terms of new chemistry. You can mix and match polymer strands. You can kind of see that right here. Platinum, copper, platinum, copper, and nickel, just like we did before. So this also tells us that lots of things can be different solvents, for example, in this nanoreactor business, and that there's a whole field that focuses on now exploiting all these capabilities and figuring out what's possible. So then you go to the periodic table and you say, okay, that's nice. You've talked about a core group of precious elements, but can we go across the entire periodic table? And initially we were kind of looking at, you can see metals routinely accessible by scanning probe block copolymer lithography. In the first 4 years, that's all we really worked with, the ones in red. Now we work with all of these because we've solved a lot of the problems that we encountered along the way in terms of how they function in reactors. Low mobility, if they're sensitive to water, hydrolyzing precursors, not reducible by hydrogen, or they're really volatile materials. We literally can make almost everything. You can see the alkali metals not over there, too volatile. Antimony and tellurium, also too volatile, but we can still use those as precursors to make bicomponent type materials as well. All these others have been made. The only ones we didn't make were the radioactive ones. We could make those as well. We just aren't set up with respect to the radioactive facilities to do that. And they're all either metals or metal oxides, depending upon how we've processed them. So this really expands the scope of what's possible here. And then you can see these are kind of the core materials that we routinely work with that are primarily metals and metal oxides. And the bulk of what we've synthesized to date actually focus on those types of structures. Okay, so how do you use this now? How do we get information out? How do we find things that ultimately matter? So when we made some of these materials, I went to a theoretician, Chris Wolverton, one of the best computational material scientists in the world, also happens to be at Northwestern. I said, look at some of these structures, give us a prediction in terms of designing a catalyst that would actually be of interest here. What should we go after? He goes, well, let's look at the HER reaction, the hydrogen evolution reaction. That's where platinum's king, and you'd like to get rid of platinum. You can look at the different types of compositions and create a volcano plot like the one shown in the left upper corner of this graph. And to make a long story short, you're looking for things that are at the top of that volcano. And you can see platinum's pretty high, but it's not the highest. There's some 3-component systems that he modeled that we had made that are even higher. Well, we can make those, and so this gives you a feel for how we can begin to design catalysts based upon these types of tools, because we can go to the lab, we can make these compositions on a glassy carbon electrode, make them in mass, and then drive them and look at how they compare to platinum. And in this game, you're basically trying to beat platinum, or be at least as good as platinum and have less platinum. And so if you look at overpotential, it's plotted in the upper left here, a bar on that graph is not good. And so if you look at this, no big surprise, platinum copper's not good, platinum nickel's not good, platinum gold's not good. Surprisingly, he thought platinum gold nickel was going to be great. That was at the top of his volcano plot. It's lousy. This is overpotential compared to platinum. The other one he predicted, platinum gold copper, is actually as good as platinum. And so I looked at the students, I said, great, we just blew $2 million trying to make a more complicated catalyst that's no better than platinum. And they said, no, you don't understand this. We made a catalyst that's as good as platinum that uses 1/7 the amount of platinum, and that was a world record at the time. And that is a win. That's an important thing where we're trying to begin to replace different types of, our reliance on different types of elements. Really critical capability here. Now, why was he wrong? I keep pointing on him being wrong as opposed to us being wrong, and he doesn't like that. And the reason, he's actually not wrong. He modeled these as alloys. Okay? What's important about this technique that I've shared with you today is before, during, and after the reaction, you can go in and characterize the particles because they're positionally encoded. And you guys can look at this. If you look in the upper right, the platinum, gold, copper, that is in fact an alloy. You can see that in the EDAX. Everything's mixed in terms of color. Look at the platinum, gold, nickel. The green and the blue phase separate. That's actually a 2-component particle and a 1-component particle. It is not the 3-component alloy that we told him to model. So he would say that we were wrong and he was right. Point is that you can begin to look at this and use a combination of theory to design new types of catalysts and test them rapidly using these types of techniques. Okay, so now if you look at this, we can make metals. I haven't talked about this. We can metal oxides, sulfides. We don't know what you can't make yet. We know you can make a lot. You have to come up with the right reactors. We can make halide perovskites. I know a lot of people in the audience are interested in those. Solar energy conversion devices, also catalysts in their own right. As long as we can come up with compatibility, we can begin to build these types of structures on demand. So that takes me to the final part of this then. How do you begin to get the information out? How do you build big libraries and begin to drive them towards technological needs? Just to give you a feel, let's say here are the halide perovskites. I can build a library of crystals, all positionally encoded. I can make them all out of one composition, but vary in size. On the left-hand side here, you can see these are with the bromide anion. If I use a laser, I can systematically go across there and replace the amount of bromine with chloride. And now I can begin to build a library of thousands of particles, crystals in this case, that systematically vary in size and composition. So how do you screen? Well, here they have optical properties. So we can screen in mass, and we can begin to focus on optical outputs that we want. And in this particular case, we were able to find the world record in terms of blue emission. And you can see it's important to be able to look at slight compositional changes. You know, cesium, lead, bromide 0.6, chloride 0.4, taken 3 times. Okay, so being able to look through this type of library to fine-tune composition and size, really critical in terms of finding the ultimate winner. I can take these arrays of pens and I can load them up with a gradient of materials, and I can flip that around and put it in the instrument and now print mega libraries in mass, where one pass, let's say if you have 1 million pens, generates 1 million features. Do that many, many times over, you get billions of features rapidly. We are now producing mega libraries with 56 million distinct features in a 2 by 2 centimeter chip. Commercially, they are approaching that as well, which is that you mentioned MAT-IQ. So this is really kind of exciting. Well, we wanted to test this. Could we find materials and catalysts that nobody had known about before? Well, somebody from the Air Force said, hey, we've got a great screening tool. This requires getting lots of different capabilities coming together. They had a Raman technique where they were trying to look for single-walled carbon nanotubes. And they were asking the question, what would be a great catalyst for generating single-walled carbon nanotubes? And they thought copper and gold would be a good compositional space to look at. Well, we took their devices and we could build their posts that are elevated, a mega library systematically varying in copper and gold composition and particle size. And then we could bring in precursor, methane, and look for the conversion of that to single-walled carbon nanotubes. And the single-walled carbon nanotube has a great distinct signature in the Raman, and so we just look at the growth rate as a function of time and conditions to see where the best catalysts are. And so that takes me to this slide here, which is really interesting. It emphasizes kind of a point that was in the video. You find hundreds of catalysts this way, many of which people never knew about before. But you only find one global winner. And that goes back to my point that I'm pretty sure as a society, we're not using the best materials for a given need. We're using the best found at that point in time, because we build infrastructures around those and then we're stuck with them. But in this particular case, you can see a rise to gold 3 copper, and then it falls again. Lots of catalysts there along the way on both sides of the apex, but one composition, gold 3 copper, in a particular size, I can't remember what it is in this particular case, that is the optimum catalyst. Okay, and I think that's an important message because that's going to be critical as we begin to think about the materials of tomorrow. And so finally, you have now this ability to make, to screen. How do you use this then to make predictions? Well, you saw in the video, Toyota came to us and they said, look, you guys are producing materials faster than anybody else on Earth. We have AI guys. We'd love to see if we can mine some of that data and begin to make predictions about materials that people haven't been able to make before. And so we were actually at the same time building a company called MAT-IQ, where matter meets intelligence, and we wanted to go down this path, especially in the catalysis space, so it seemed like a great early partnership to test capabilities. And they came in and looked at these libraries, the 7-element systems I showed you that had these really tortured structures. Remember the different domains, and you could have as many as 4 or 5 different interfaces within a given particle. They took that structural data, trained algorithms, and then began to challenge them and say, can we make predictions that a material scientist could not make? For example, instead of getting a 4-phase particle, can we get a 2-phase particle with a single interface with as many as 6 elements? Make a long story short, it predicted 19 different possibilities. No material scientist on Earth could predict them. We could go make them, and 18 of 19 were correct, including the most complex single interface nanoparticle ever synthesized. That's shown here. 6 elements, giving us the stoichiometry and the elements to get that. And just to show you this is not like luck, These are the types of structures that you would get. We could get them, we could characterize them and see where they were successful and where they had failed. And all of that, of course, goes into building better and better algorithms. This is just a glimpse at where this is all headed. We're going to drive this down the clean energy space. I mentioned MatIQ or Matique. They're building this around electric catalysis. Why electric catalysis? Geared towards clean energy, one common infrastructure. The problem with this is it's a little bit like drinking out of a fire hose, right? It's not just all the things you can synthesize, but how do you get the information out? If you look for new materials that allow you to electrically generate chemicals of interest, common infrastructure in terms of screening, and then of course you're generating enormous amounts of data that can begin to be used to feed AI algorithms and create really high value capabilities in that space. Okay, I've run out of time. I just want to acknowledge the folks that have done the work. I've got incredibly talented graduate students and postdocs, one of the biggest operations in the world. They are just, they come from all different parts of the world, united by one theme, and that is they love to do nanoscience, and they have as much fun as I do doing science. One of them is in the audience, Andrei Ivankin. He's been involved with me now for about 20 years. We've spun off a lot of companies, and these guys are really, really talented and motivated and can do tremendous things, and have led to a lot of the success that I'm getting recognized for, including our own Dr. Ali Al-Hassan. I will stop there and be happy to answer any questions if there are any. Thanks. Are we doing questions or not? Yeah, so there are two versions of these tools. One is where you put chemicals on the tips and you just deposit in mass different materials because of the gradients that you put on the tips. The other is where you're using the tips as light pipes. We actually have a opaque material coating them, and then we etch at the tips areas that allow us to use them as lenses to drive light through the back where we can locally control photochemistry on the other side. And what Andre did was he created a device that has, I think it's more than 22,000, but one version of it is 22,000 independently addressable tips that allow you to do different things at once, where you're locally controlling where things are occurring based upon whether you're passing light and affecting chemistry on the other side or not.
Yes, it's about the way they pass through light. I remember through my chemistry class that the light wavelength says how you identify which isomer you produced. But I'm thinking, how can this be used for mass producing medicines, for example? But it's been ongoing. It's a research interest that.
No, I think it's look, combinatorial chemistry has been used extensively in the medical discovery space. It is the backbone of how we discover now, because you can create lots of shots on goal. There are many ways to think about using these tools to build libraries of materials that allow you to look for new medicines, or to build libraries that allow you to control things as simple as crystallization. Bob Langer looked at this and he said, man, this tool is fantastic. You could begin to look at all the different types of polymorphs in a given drug by doing crystallization in mass, but in different ways across an entire substrate. So we're actually using the argument that the world has just seen a revolution in terms of sequencing, in terms of genomics, based upon our ability to build libraries that allow us to do experiments in a massively parallel way. This is taking it to a whole new level, and it's driving it, in our case, not towards medicine. You can go towards medicine if you'd like, but towards materials discovery in the inorganic space, where we have not seen that type of capability.
Yeah, I'm just noticing potential application to your research.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
No, it's good.
Thank you so much for the fascinating class. My general chemistry students are here. They think I'm a fraud as well. So we tell you this is what your textbook says, but this is amazing. My question is, do you think it's we have these nanoparticles of different methods, the reproducibility in terms of, is it a surface phenomena or is it like I'm thinking of polymers when you have segregated regions of this method versus that?
Yeah, so these are materials, not molecules, right? So I always say that I can make a mole of molecules where every molecule has the exact same structure and exact same properties. I can't make a mole of particles where any two particles are identical. Now, where you win in this, and where the world wins in this, is that in many cases we use materials that have kind of an average structure and take advantage of that. Now, you have to be careful because if you only look at one particle, you might have the wrong orientation. You might have a variation that either leads to a great effect or a weak effect. The way we get around that is we use duplicates. So if you have 56 million features, exactly. So each quadrant might have what we call 2,500 of the exact same particle. And then we screen those to make sure that on average that particle, because when we make them and put them back on a substrate, we don't have control over orientation and things like that as well. So the beauty of this is the large number allows you to not only do a lot of experiments, but to get statistically significant data.
A follow-up question. A universal catalyst, is that a possibility in the future?
A universal catalyst?
Yes.
I guess it depends on how you define it. I would say a universal way of finding the catalyst you need is the more likely. And that's what you just saw.
Awesome.
Over here.
Well, I start by saying thank you very much for this nice talk. So basically, I'm a material scientist, and this is very impressive to me. And I have a feeling that we are being put out of business, kind of, like with your army of billions of small reactors. I mean, the conventional work of seeking materials, I agree with you, it's time-consuming and so on. Now, I have two questions. First of all, how would you qualify these small reactors in terms of? I have the feeling that this is kind of equilibrium type of processing. Now, would you agree with this, that following equilibrium type of thermodynamics? And which would lead me to the other question, and in the perspective of these high entropy alloys, for example. Here I see clear patterns that are defined, which is far from being high entropy. Can you manage to make these reactors out of equilibrium? If yes, how?
Yeah, the answer is yes, you can. What I've talked about is you're exactly right. We try to drive everything to the thermodynamic product. And we're using high temperature and long annealing times to get there. We also have systems, we've published on this, where you can intentionally go to different types of conditions, where you slowly move and evolve from kinetic products to thermodynamic products and look at that transition every step of the way. For example, you can use that to learn a lot about alloying and dealloying. How does gold and silver alloy? It's very, very interesting when you look at it at the particle scale. We can start where initially you'll have primarily a gold core and a silver shell, and you can watch then over time, because the gold reduces first and the silver then coats it. You can watch the silver then slowly diffuse into the gold in that type of kinetic transition. You can use quenching types of protocols too. It all depends on how you want to set it. This is no different from conventional chemistry, other than the fact that we're not using glass beakers. We're using a droplet that is both the solvent and the reactor. We're using a lot of the tricks that people use in chemistry and material science to control the products that we see and whether we're working in a kinetic or thermodynamic regime. And then I'll finish. I don't think we'll put you out of business. I think we'll just redirect people down different paths. These become really powerful tools. I think that it gives a researcher effectively an army. You don't have to go to Northwestern and work with that army to do it. I mean, with a tool like this, you can get done so much more than any of the best individuals on earth can do, just because you're winning with numbers.
If you don't mind, I have two other questions. First of all, you kind of started touching on this. How do you see the future of this material scientist within this perspective? And the other thing is, with the movie that you showed us with the fluorescence and the brightening, how fast is the imaging then? I mean, what's the frequency?
Yeah, so that's done over a couple of hours, but that's by design. I mean, we can speed it up or slow it down based upon the temperature. We drop the temperature to minus 100 and then bring it up. If we want to ramp it fast, we can make coalescence go faster, or we can slow it down. It all depends upon the mobility, the materials, and what we're trying to see. So we're intentionally trying to make that a slow process so that we can tease out some of the fundamental parameters involved in the coalescence and ripening process. What was the first part?
Material scientists' future within this.
Yeah, no, look, I think these are going to be workhorse tools. Look, if the dream is right, I think that there'll be an inflection point. And that inflection point is going to correlate in this point in time, where you're going to see the rate at which we discover materials as a society go up dramatically fast. And it's because of these types of scaling capabilities that makes that possible. The second thing is, that I think is really important, the bet we're making, is that we're going to be able to do for materials and this is a much more challenging problem, what the AlphaFold folks did for protein folding. And remember, in the early days, a lot of people said, oh, you'll never be able to solve that problem. Well, that's routine now. I mean, AlphaFold's being used. It all comes down to who has the data, who has really high quality data inputs. And we think that these types of libraries put us in an incredibly strong position to basically corner that capability. And I think those tools will lead to a marked change in the pace at which we discover materials that matter. And we will go to machines initially as a first guess. I'd like to make a material that has this set of properties. Not that you're going to believe it necessarily from the start, but that's where I'm going to look. And I can use the printing tools to begin to look around that particular space to see, was the machine prediction accurate, or was it slightly off or way off?
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for the insight. I just want to ask, if for drug delivery purposes, if you have heat combinations, have you looked at maybe having standardized references that can be used universally anywhere for drug delivery? If you have combinations that you think would help move forward the drug delivery space, would you have reference materials when you have them, so that anywhere anyone can pick these combinations and use them?
You mean where you're kind of selling the libraries or something? Is that what you're asking? We don't do that. So I mean, you could do that. I mean, that's something that could be done. I mean, people can develop a capability on the high throughput screening side of things. My goal as an academic scientist was, look, the world knows that high throughput has been incredibly beneficial on the biological side of things, been very helpful in the medical side of things, will continue to play a role there. These probably will as well. But where there's a big gap and a big hole is on the inorganic side of things, and beginning to build that capability along with the AI capabilities by utilizing this. And we looked at that as the big opportunity target. Not that it's better or worse, it's just different. And to me, it was a much bigger challenge, and where we could make a bigger mark in a shorter period of time. Can you speak up?
I wanted to ask you, is all of this applicable to metals only, or can we use other materials such as non-metals perhaps?
You got to go a little louder. I still couldn't hear you.
I was asking, is this applicable only to metals, or can we use other materials?
No. I think you can use lots of different materials. As I said, it's a matter of reactor and reactant compatibility. So even with the metals, and the metal sulfides and the metal oxides, we have to play with the different materials. We don't always use the polyethylene oxide poly-2-vinyl pyridine as the reactor material. We use high volatility solvents, sulfolanes and DMSO, for example. It just comes down to what you want to synthesize and the compatibility of the precursors with what you're calling the reactor composition. But I think that's the exciting part of it, is, you know, a field that is I think, going to explode in terms of people defining what you can and cannot do with these types of tools.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mirkin.